Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping national security and defense. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. Earlier today, Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly unveiled Canada's Arctic foreign policy. To tease out the implications of the document and announcement and dive into the major takeaways, we'll be speaking with Dr. Huebert and Whitney Lackenbauer. We're going to cover Arctic diplomacy, implications for DND, Arctic security threats, and more, so we hope you enjoy. This is the Expert Series. Dr. Huebert, thanks again for joining the Expert Series. Always a great pleasure to have you on. As our audience will know, the Arctic Foreign Policy Update came out today. It was announced last night and announced earlier this morning. So Dr. Huebert, maybe for our audience, you could paint a picture here. What were maybe some of the key Arctic challenges the government has been grappling with or thinking about going into the policy announcement? And then, to what extent do you think this new document might successfully grasp the security environment, and what steps does it kind of lay out to address some of these challenges?
Well, thank you, Josh. It's always a pleasure. Well, to start off with, the substance of the actual policy statement, in other words, just looking at it in isolation, is actually a significant step forward from pre-existing documents such as the 2019 Arctic framework. In this document, it's clear that they have thought very carefully about the emerging threat environment within the Arctic. They still acknowledge the significance of climate change and have that as their number 4 point in terms of the identification of issue areas. But I think what is significant is, of course, is that they've come to terms with the changing geopolitical environment. They've recognized that, in fact, that the impacts of the war in Ukraine have worldwide impacts, including that and especially that of the Arctic. They have recognized that the interest in the Chinese are not simply being good scientists and being good business people within that region. In fact, that there is a security ramification for their actions. All of this is recognized within the context of the foreign policy, and that is to be applauded. It also, of course, keeps with the ongoing theme of the importance of human security for the northern Indigenous peoples and draws out many of the security issues that they face also. But of course, that is looking a little bit more on the domestic side, but nevertheless, I mean, politically, I couldn't expect to see the government ignore that very important human security component. So the actual written document is probably in isolation is a good document. Now, the problem, of course, is here we are in 2024. They are acknowledging that the war in Ukraine, of course, has worldwide ramifications. And as they refuse to acknowledge, the war in Ukraine, of course, starts in 2014, not 2022. And again, we look back to their preceding action from a foreign policy perspective. And, from that period of 2014 to 2022, they tried very hard to follow what many characterize as a policy of Arctic exceptionalism. And that, of course, is the idea that what is happening worldwide, and particularly that of a negative geopolitical consequence, doesn't affect the Arctic. I mean, they went so far as to have a conference that was headed by then Minister Dion to try to assure the Russians that everything in the Arctic was going to continue to go on, even though that the Russians had invaded and seized Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. So that is a reversal of their policy. The second part that is a reversal of preceding policy, and it's a positive step, is, of course, in the 2019, they introduced this concept of exercising sovereignty. They didn't talk about defending sovereignty. They didn't talk about the means in which is necessary to ensure that Canadian Arctic sovereignty is protected, but they talked about exercising and said sort of, well, we've got this under control. Don't worry, be happy. The reality is, of course, within this document, is they make it very clear that they need to continue to protect Arctic sovereignty. The problem, of course, is at this point in 2024, really what they're talking about is protecting Canadian Arctic security, not sovereignty. And so it's sort of like, okay, it's good to see them coming up into the language that has been used by all of their predecessors, liberals and conservative, but again, is sort of a little too, it's good, but a little bit too late in terms of some of the overall threats that we are now facing.
Well, Rob, that's a great scene setter. Thank you for that. Are there any new promised investments outlined in the policy that are of any note?
Well, this is, of course, is a document that is written by Global Affairs Canada, and they have limited abilities to do the actual investing. They did a decent job of connecting to the defense update, which was entirely focused on the Arctic, of course, and it is the D&D that is really going to bear the lion's share if, in fact, the commitments are upheld. It is the modernization of NORAD, which D&D has to take care of. It's the purchase of the F-35s, which D&D has to take care of, and presumably the purchase of the new submarines, all very expensive line items, but it's not from GAC's budget. The one part that GAC does promise, and new funds were, of course, allocated, was the renewal of the Arctic ambassador. We've had two Arctic ambassadors before. There were Mary Simon, who is, of course, our Governor General now, and Jack Akaluk, who was a former Liberal MP. Once again, you start seeing a bit of a commonality who gets appointed to these positions, but that is the way of the world, I guess. And so we are expecting to see a third ambassador appointed. We are finally, and I say finally with a bit of a sense of exasperation, going to be opening up consulates in both Alaska and in Greenland. And so this is something that has been needed to be done a long, long time ago. That will require more funding, but I mean, of course, it's funding within the creation of a consular office in that context. But again, this isn't meant as a criticism of GAC. GAC doesn't have line items to really expend. But it is important to note that they are saying that they are going to ensure, for the sake of Canadian Northerners, and for our allies and friends, that in fact that we follow through with what we say within the D&D document.
Well, Rob, I also note that in the document there's some talk of negotiating boundaries over the Beaufort Sea and implementing potentially a boundary agreement between Canada and Denmark as well over the Hans Island. How do you foresee these kinds of potential negotiations going down, especially as we're looking at, our government transitioning potentially, as well as the, an incoming Trump administration?
Yeah, well, the first one is, of course, they are patting themselves on the back, and they deserve a certain degree of credit. Remember, they basically negotiated a deal with the Danes over Hans Island. Now, one could be critical and say, well, they basically surrendered the part of that Canada had a total claim on, but that's nitpicking. The reality is they resolved an ongoing diplomatic dispute that had gotten both silly and serious at various times. And so that one has been resolved. The Beaufort Sea boundary issue has been one that has been in existence since both countries declared a 200-mile EEZ back in, I think it was 1977. So this has been a very hard one to resolve, partly because it involves what we think may be significant oil and gas resources, though of course, given the fact that there seems to be a move by the current government to ever develop further oil and gas in the Arctic region, that's probably less of a consideration. The other complicating factor is, of course, is the Western Nunavut land claim settlement agreement that was reached in 1982. And that, of course, gives a significant say over the maritime dimension of that particular land claim settlement. Obviously, the Canadian delegation is going to have to include some representation from that. The question that going forward is, how do the Americans then respond in terms of the issue going forward on that one? The fact that they are negotiating is a good sign, but we have to stay tuned on that context. In relation to what it means to the Trump administration, one of the critical points that Trump is making very clear is that he has put a priority on borders. Now, it could be borders with the Mexicans, it could be borders in terms of economic transactions, and that means Canada and Mexico and others. And there is no doubt that he will also be looking at northern borders for security, i.e., what is going to be done for NORAD modernization. Presumably, this document is, in fact, probably partially written to assure the Americans that this time we are serious. because the Americans have become somewhat questioning of our constant refrain that, yes, we are going to do things with the border. We saw the statement in the 2017 defense policy, strong, secure, and engaged, that said, yes, we're doing the NORAD modernization, but we saw very little funds going into it. We saw the 2019 document saying, yes, we'll do what we said we're going to do in 2017, of course, and here we are in 2024. And so when it comes to America and the borders, I think the negotiations probably will go on in terms of the Beaufort because it's in both countries' interests. But the broader issue, of course, will be underlining some of the reasons why this document exists.
Oh, well, thank you again, Dr. Huebert. The document and Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly also mentioned Russia several times, mentioned, Russia has no red lines. So I'm curious if you could maybe elucidate what concerns the government has, particularly in the Arctic when it comes to Russia and Canada.
She made it very clear, and she used a line in answering a reporter's question that conflict has no limits. And she specifically said that the actions of the Russians in Syria, in the Indo-Pacific, and in the Arctic carry over from their aggressive actions from the Ukraine, and that there is a real concern that the Russians will continue to use aggressive action. Again, this is a somewhat new position that this government has taken. I mean, Freeman, when the second phase of the Ukrainian war started, did say that the world had changed. A little bit hard to see given the fact that the war was at that point 8 years old. But, if they think it's changed and that's going to be something good, great. So she clearly said that the guardrails containing Russian behavior was gone. And that was clear that, in fact, that they are concerned about ongoing aggression. There was a little bit of stick handling on the part of the government when it came to the Arctic Council, because on the one hand, she made it clear that there will be no engagement with the Russians for as long as they remain aggressor state within Ukraine, whether or not that means that should there be a Trump-imposed settlement where Ukraine has to surrender significant elements of their territory. Does that mean that the Arctic Council will be restarted? But it's not clear. But she did talk about working closer with the other non-Russian members of the Arctic Council. But she also said, and she repeated from the document, that the Arctic Council will maintain itself. So she alluded to the fact that this was particularly the position of the permanent participants. That's the indigenous groups that also comprise of the Arctic Council. So I think that there was sort of a bit of an indication that there's a little bit of a division there that they were trying to resolve in that particular context. The bottom line is that Russia is painted in some of the most starkly aggressive terms that I've seen in a Canadian document since the end of the Cold War.
Rob, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us briefly to discuss the Arctic Foreign Policy document. Now, one of the big things we do here or try to do at the CDA is educate Canadians about the importance of defense policy and security. So I'd like to turn it back to you for any final thoughts on the importance of this document or issue. And, you and I are out west outside of Ottawa here talking about Canadian defense policy. Why should the average Canadian care about this document and Arctic security?
Why Canadians should care is that the two threats that are facing Canada, climate change and an aggressor, Russia and China, are existential threats. We may think that the three oceans and the United States protect us, but given the type of weapon systems that we now see associated with both the Russians and the Chinese, with the intent and actions that they have had, the statements of Russia threatening nuclear war on an increasingly, one could almost say, shrill tone, all of this portrays a very dangerous environment. And so it's indicative of Canada to be able to, first and foremost, offer the ability in whatever way it can to deter the Russians and the Chinese, because remember, the document makes it very clear that the two are operating together, to deter them from even thinking about taking military action that would, of course, involve North America and hence Canada. However, I think that there's an added realization that deterrence may not work, that we have waited too long to be able to convince the Russians and Chinese, and that means that we have to have the capability of being able to respond. Now, this is the kicker. I mean, it's a good thing that we are, in fact, recognizing this. This shows up a little bit more in the defense budget or defense update than with the Arctic, but it still, nevertheless, is an important point that if deterrence fails, you need to be able to defend. The other side of the coin that is even more complicated, of course, is that most observers are very concerned in what direction that Trump is going to take the American government. So this document is also important in an effort not only to tell Canadians how we are going to protect Canada from from the growing Russian and Chinese threat, but also how we will assure the Americans that we are not, in fact, the weak link. I think a final point needs to be stressed here, though, and this is one of the difficulties that we're facing with this orientation of the government. We now have a defense policy. We have a defense update. We have a northern framework, and we have an Arctic foreign policy. But for the first time, and I'm trying to remember the last time that a Canadian government did not have a foreign policy, and I think you have to go back to Louis Saint Laurent, but once again, I would have to double check that. We don't have a foreign policy. I mean, very much to your point, what does this matter for Canadians? Well, we're facing this very complicated and increasingly dangerous international arena. And now we have a foreign policy mainly for Northerners. If you saw the press conference, if you saw the focus of making sure that the interests of Northern Canadians are protected, which is a very powerful and important thing to be doing, it leads you thinking, okay, so you can do it for the population of the North, which is approximately 140,000, and that is very needed because they have the triple threats of climate change, human security, and geopolitics. And good on the government for being able to enunciate that. But it left me thinking, what about the other 41 million? Because within the overall context of Canada, if everything that they say is true, then I do accept the argumentation on the existential threats of both climate change and geopolitical. The evidence is pretty clear in my mind. Why don't we have a foreign policy then telling Canadians and the world what, in fact, our foreign policy is going to be? And again, of course, we don't have an official foreign policy. I mean, some analysts, such as Kim Nasso, has made the very strong argument that our foreign policy is a policy of diaspora support. In other words, that the government has a foreign policy when it comes to certain key ethnic groups that it responds to, but in terms of something that is directed to all Canadians, we don't have. And so the paradox is that as good of a job as they did on this policy by itself, as I said, it may be a little too late in terms of what it is promising to do, but we'll see in terms of time. The policy itself is very clear. And so obviously the government has the capability of producing an equally good foreign policy, but, and here's the thing that disturbs me, they don't have the will to do so. In other words, they're choosing to give us an Arctic foreign policy, but they're choosing not to give us a foreign policy. And I found that very disturbing, to be perfectly honest. So it's an interesting paradox. By doing such a good job on the foreign policy, it just illustrates the greater problem of the lack of foreign policy.
Rob, thanks for your time today, and we appreciate your thought leadership here at the CDA Institute. Thanks for guiding us through this this new update with the Arctic foreign policy, and it's always a pleasure to have you on. Well, Whitney, thanks for being on the podcast again. It's always great to have you and have your thought leadership. So I appreciate you taking some time to talk to the CDA Institute today.
Always great to be on with you, Josh, as well.
So as you'll know, and as our audience will know, Canada just unveiled a new Arctic foreign policy document. So I'm wondering if before we get into the kind of mechanics of that, maybe you can discuss what some of our key security concerns are at present in the Arctic, and then maybe we can talk about the extent to which the document kind of addresses those concerns.
No, it's wonderful. It's a great question, Josh. And I think many of our CDAI listeners will think about security as defense. And that's certainly a big part of it. So when I think about defense threats, I often break it down, and I think I've done a podcast with you before on threats through to and in the Arctic. So I often think, are these threats that are passing through the Arctic? Are they threats that are targeting the Arctic? Or are they threats that are already there? So even with this document, it's one of those frames that I bring to bear to say we do have global competitors. We're in a world of heightened strategic competition. So a lot of the worry is Russia and China, and where their actions and even alignments within the Arctic have us rethinking deterrence and our ability to defend, whether it's the North American homeland or NATO sovereign territory. That's sort of the first level. Then there's also this basket of threats to the Arctic. And we see in the Canadian Arctic Foreign Policy Statement everything from, Russian flights, now sometimes, at least on one occasion, with Chinese, fighters alongside them, flying, or bombers, pardon me, sort of flying up to the approaches of the North American air identification zones. That's sort of a known. But we also see activities below the threshold of armed conflict. A lot of marine scientific research, let's say, that's also collecting dual use, so civilian and military data. It's looking at other types of surveillance platforms that are out there collecting data, generalized increases in maritime activity, pernicious foreign investment. Here's where we start to expand beyond the defense realm into the broader national security space. And then within the Arctic itself, of course, we have this overall driver of climate change. Once again, reading in the official statements that Canadian Arctic is warming 4 times that of the global average, the impacts of that on northern communities, the increasing burden that imposed on the Canadian Armed Forces to be ready for OPLENTIS missions, so domestic emergency response missions. So you package it all together, and we do face quite a different threat environment, even than we did back in 2019 when Canada first unveiled its Arctic and Northern policy framework.
That is a great scene setter, Whitney. I'm wondering if we might be able to now go a bit more in detail about what the document outlines, what it maybe articulates as areas of focus, and if there are any steps it implements, what we can expect next.
Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch in this document here. So again, looking at it, I almost separated out. Some of it is, it's all purporting to be new, because that's the way these documents are packaged, and that's really important for partisan purposes within our system. But I think some of the document actually is quite continuous with the Arctic foreign policy that Canada has been articulating since 2000. Other parts of it show some pretty substantive changes, and then there are a few elements of it that are new. So first sort of bundle is it sets up the strategic challenges facing the Arctic. And here's where it talks very much about Russia as a strategic competitor, even kind of breaching that line we've heard from the Prime Minister and others talking about them in adversarial terms these days, which is a change. Definitely a big change in tone from 2019, where there was still talk of Russia as an Arctic nation where we had shared interests and where cooperation would benefit everyone. Now we see a very different tone and messaging in this, where it's clearly also signaling that there is going to be no business as usual with Russia as long as it continues this brutal, unprovoked war in Ukraine. So that's key. Also talks a bit about adaptations to Arctic governance. The Arctic Council is still held up as the premier forum for dialogue amongst the Arctic states with the partnership of Indigenous peoples, but obviously that relationship on a high political level is very much constrained because we can't be signaling to Russia that there can be business as usual. So it kind of dances in the document a bit of a fine line between, it's important that the work between scientists and Indigenous peoples continue, but at the same time, we can't expect at the ministerial or senior Arctic official ambassadorial level to see the Arctic Council going back to what it once was. There's again talking about climate change as this overarching threat. I found at times Canada's a bit confusing in articulating or differentiating between what are our efforts at mitigating versus dealing with adaptation to climate change. And I think that also manifests itself here. But one of the other big frames that I find interesting is that we're perceiving a new challenge to Arctic state primacy. So Arctic state primacy being that the Arctic states should have the first and foremost voice in anything going on within the region, and that this is really perceived as being challenged by actors like China. And the document also sets up a sort of Sino-Russian, so China-Russia relationship that's affording China access into the region with some additional profile. So really interesting. 4 pillars, nothing surprising here. Asserting Canada's sovereignty, I think, rephrasing or reframing of our North Strong and Free, the April 2024 Defense Policy Update. Been interesting work on bridging intelligence gaps, making sure that we're sharing information with our allies, also with territorial provincial governments, with Indigenous government partners in the Canadian North. Quite interesting. A lot more emphasis on research security. So seeing research as a vector for foreign influence, which I think is really, was very inspiring to me. And then talking about strengthening regional defense and security architectures, including a proposal for a new foreign affairs minister dialogue on security. So how exactly that will play out, I think, remains to be defined. We already have the Arctic Chiefs and Heads of Defense meeting. We already have Arctic Security Forces Roundtable. We already have certain NATO bodies that need to discuss these issues. We have the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. Now sort of this proposal to adopt sort of promote or progress a Canadian initiative to convene the Ministers of Foreign Affairs. I think this is exciting, but at the same time a challenge, Josh, because many of the listeners will know Canada has not had a full-scale foreign policy articulated since, I think, 2005, Paul Martin government. And we don't have a current national security strategy. It's also 20 years old. So in order to even be able to nest a Canadian foreign minister-led security dialogue, I think we still have some homework, and that's where I really hope that we do achieve what was promised in our North Strong and Free, to have those security strategies put out. So again, also just quickly saying, pragmatic diplomacy is another category, typically, and I think appropriately, focusing on the US as our key ally, key partner in the Arctic as elsewhere. A lot of emphasis as well in this document, which I warmly welcomed, on the Nordic states, partnerships both bilaterally and regionally with the Nordic countries, who are all now NATO allies with us as well. So real opportunities there. And then also a framing of the North American Arctic, which I think for the first time in official policy terms includes Greenland. So talk about reopening a consulate in Anchorage, but also opening up a Canadian consulate in Nuuk, Greenland, which will help to bridge that, what I think is often in many Canadians' mental maps, a real divide between Canada and Europe, beginning at the Davis Strait, but now we're sort of pushing that eastward. So again, I found that the document, from a security standpoint, didn't offer a ton that was new, but was a useful consolidation of what we've seen discussed and released over the last few years, and at least gives it a bit of foreign policy top cover, which was sorely lacking.
Well, I mean, that's a fantastic overview, Whitney. Thank you for that. I'm wondering if you might be able to discuss any relevance at all here for D&D, or if there's any kind of overlap between the document we saw today and, you know, our more harder defense-oriented ambitions or projects we should be focusing on to help in this process of securing the North and safeguarding our sovereignty.
No, it's an excellent point. So what I almost see this document serving from a D&D CAF standpoint is it gives that diplomacy side to what's already been articulated in our North Strong and Free, even in Strong, Secure, Engaged, which was developing a defense policy and a series of commitments to bolster defense without that foreign policy context in which to nest it. So here, rather than, I think, seeing it as articulating something new for defense and security practitioners, I think what it does is shows now the possibility of synchronizing our defense efforts with diplomacy efforts, and talk of, for example, increasing diplomatic representation, in my mind, inherently carries with it opportunities for defense attaches, people to go and use those footprints as a way to enhance relationships that exist. In the case of Greenland, with JACO, the Danish Arctic Command based in Nuuk, in Alaska with Alaska Command, with NORAD forces based there. I mean, I still see these as very useful opportunity spaces. And I think for defense practitioners, also this frame of the North American Arctic, inclusive of Greenland and Alaska, and really also in this document a pivot towards thinking not just about the North Atlantic Arctic nexus, which I think is bread and butter for so many of us, right? The Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom gap, the sort of lifeline from North America to support our Northern European allies in time of conflict with Russia, goes back to the Cold War. Right now, we also see an articulation of a North Pacific Arctic approach to the Canadian North, which I think is helpful as we pivot and think about how we're also supporting the Americans, right? Not just to the Atlantic, but also thinking about how we're supporting the Americans and competing in a North Pacific Arctic context. To me, that is a real fresh way of also reinvigorating some of our conversations in the defense and security community to think about what we're going to do with, really, I think, very capable platforms that are either online, like the Harry DeWolf class of Arctic and offshore patrol vessels, or capabilities coming online, like the F-35s, when we finally receive them and are able to deploy them, to think that it's not just an eastward-oriented mission set. It now really is a northern, but also northwestern or western-oriented one that sees the U.S. not just as a southern partner, but also a western partner. So anyway, I think that the mental maps that this helps to frame are useful, and hopefully will also encourage some thinking in what I thought was a deficit in Our North Strong and Free, in thinking about how Canada is supporting the northern flank of NATO in the European high north and Arctic. I think we begin to see with this foreign policy nested or placed alongside the defense policy update, a way to sort of think about exciting opportunities where Canada is helping to do that kind of forward defense, reassurance, deterrence missions in the high north of Europe, like we're doing so importantly in Latvia.
Well, Whitney, thanks. I guess I would leave it with one more question before I turn it to you for final thoughts. For the average Canadian listening, or maybe a more general audience, what should their biggest takeaway be from this new the policy, and in a broader sense, why should they care about Arctic security? Canada is a big country. A lot of people live along the U.S.-Canada border, feeling quite far away from some of these challenges. What would you maybe say to them?
I think the Arctic has always been, in the last almost 100 years, certainly since the Second World War, really key to thinking about defense of the Canadian homeland. And I think when we think about where the Arctic fits in overall North American defense, how important those northern approaches to North America are for our American ally, and the cornerstone of certainly the nuclear deterrence of North America, right, residing with the US, us taking on the responsibilities that we must take on as a sovereign actor, a self-respecting nation, North American nation, to me means that this is something that we have to all be invested in. I think still we're working to precise the messaging, so we're setting up the right expectations. I think one of the pieces that also came out in the verbal comments around the release this morning by Minister Joly, Minister Blair, Minister Van Dal, and others, and a lot of the northern leaders, was a lot of focus on investments in infrastructure and that in the north that will also bring benefits to northern Canadians. I think it's important for us to temper those expectations, but at the same time see this, as some of those commentators were suggesting, as part of an overall nation building exercise. And I think that is part of the story of the Canadian North, maybe a mixed story historically, but one now where Northerners are really at the table. And I think there's real exciting opportunity space here as well to think about how Canadians reaching, and I hope exceeding, that 2% of GDP goal as we've committed to as in defense spending under NATO, can also be a catalyst for smart investments that also provide some components of the infrastructure that's needed in the north. So why I think Canadians should care is I think this is an opportunity space. We have to be secure. We have our responsibilities for continental defense. The Arctic is part of that. But here's a chance for Canadians working with northern partners and allied partners to really be quite innovative and to really embrace the fact that we are naturally, leaders in the north. And that's not just in our north, that's a circumpolar world. And I think this helps to give us part of the piece to that puzzle of how we actually embrace that identity and seize that opportunity.
Well, very eloquently put there, Whitney, and a great way to close out this discussion. We've covered a lot. Really here, we've crammed a lot into about 15 minutes. I just want to give you one more opportunity before we wrap things up here, see if there's anything you think maybe we missed, if there's one thing you'd like to drive home. Yeah, floor is yours.
Well, I think it is coming back to the notion of this was very much framed not as a brand new foreign policy statement. It was seen to supplement that which was already articulated in 2019. And again, I encourage listeners to think about this as part of what has become over the decades what I like to cast as Canada's Northern Strategy or Canada's Arctic Foreign Policy. That's the title of it, but I'm casting it here in terms that are actually transcending individual political parties. And when I look at what's in this document, I really hope that whatever the future holds, this is something that our political elites, leaders of all stripes, can come and stand behind and see through, because our challenge as a country, to be frank, is implementing. We come up with policies, we come up with strategies. At the end of the day, this is going to take a concerted effort and a long-term effort to see through to fruition. And I'm glad that this is another part of the equation in pulling this off alongside ONSIF, but it is time to roll up our sleeves, and we'll have to dig into our pockets as well and lay some cash on the table to make this all happen. So here's hoping that this really consolidates this commitment that's been articulated to the Arctic as being a strategic theater, and one that's not going to diminish in importance. It's going to amplify in importance in the coming years.
Whitney, thank you for joining us as always. We appreciate your thought leadership here at the CDA Institute. I hope to do this again sometime. And thanks for joining me at 6 p.m. on a Friday night before the weekend. I really appreciate it. That brings an end to today's special episode of the Expert Series. Thank you for joining us. And if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a review, send us an email, or reach out to us on social media. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thanks once again to our guests, Rob Huebert and Whitney Lackenbauer. Until next time.